The galaxy called humanity weak. Seconds later, entire fleets vanished. The Vethari ambassador did not look at me when he said it. He was addressing the full chamber, 700 delegates from across the known galaxy, and he spoke as if I were a piece of furniture that had accidentally been given a chair. Humanity, he said, his translator module pushing his words into smooth, practiced English, remains a pre-threat classification. They have no standing here beyond observation rights. I was sitting at the edge of the delegate table, the furthest seat from the central podium, exactly where they had placed my nameplate. My coffee had gone cold. I picked it up anyway and took a slow sip. My name is Ilara Voss. I am 44 years old. I grew up in Leeds, in a house with a leaking roof and a father who fixed engines for a living. I have spent the last 19 years of my life in deep space diplomacy, most of it invisible, most of it thankless. I am the first human being to attend the Galactic Grand Conclave as an official representative of Earth. And the moment I walked into that chamber, every species in it decided I was not worth worrying about. They were not subtle about it. The Murai delegation, four-armed and iridescent, had actually moved their chairs a few centimeters away from mine when I sat down. The Torvan ambassador, a tall being with gray skin and enormous black eyes, had looked at me the way a person looks at an insect that has wandered onto their dinner plate, not with anger, with mild inconvenience. That was the thing that stayed with me, even then, even in those first few minutes inside the most powerful political chamber in the galaxy. It was not hatred. It was not fear. It was the quiet, settled confidence of beings who had never once considered that they might be wrong about us. The Vethari ambassador continued. His name was Counselor Drev, and he was physically impressive by any standard, nearly 3 meters tall, with a chest that looked like it had been carved from pale stone. His species had been the dominant force in galactic politics for over 4 centuries. They had built the conclave. They had written most of its rules. They had, on 3 separate occasions, absorbed neighboring civilizations that objected to those rules. We recommend, Drev continued, that humanity's border territories be registered under provisional hegemony oversight. This is a protective measure. Humans have demonstrated no capacity for independent strategic governance at the interstellar level. I wrote something in my notepad, not because I needed to. I write things down when I am thinking hard, and I was thinking very hard right now. What I wrote was a single word: patience. I had been sent here with very specific instructions from the Earth Coordination Council. I was not to provoke. I was not to escalate. I was not to reveal anything about our capabilities, our plans, or the decades of quiet work that had been going on in the dark spaces between stars, while the rest of the galaxy laughed at our primitive ships and our funny little planet. I was here to observe, to be ignored, to let them think they had already won. The session continued for another 3 hours. Drev outlined the terms of what he called provisional human oversight in careful, diplomatic language that meant, without ever saying so directly, that Earth's sovereignty would be limited. Its border systems would be monitored by Vethari patrol vessels, and any human expansion would require hegemony approval. He presented this as an act of generosity. Several delegates applauded. I took notes. A small delegate from the Orvai Compact, a species that looked remarkably like tall, thin birds, leaned across to me during a recess and whispered that they were sorry, that there was nothing they could do, that the Vethari were simply too powerful to oppose. I smiled at them. That is all right, I said. We understand how power works. They looked uncertain about whether that was reassuring or not. At the end of the session, Counselor Drev walked past my seat. He did not stop. He did not acknowledge me. I watched him move through the room, and I thought about all the things I knew that he did not know I knew. I thought about the 40 years of missions we had called deep space cartography expeditions, about the relay nodes the size of basketballs, dark and silent, and undetectable by any sensor doctrine in current use by any species in this room, seated across every major transit corridor in the galaxy. About the 12,000 engineers and physicists who had worked in classified facilities on 6 different moons to build something that had no name in any alien language, because no alien had ever conceived of it. I thought about the word I was about to transmit to Earth. I waited until the chamber had mostly emptied. Then I stepped into the corridor, activated my personal comms device, which to any scan would look like a standard human communication tool, which it was mostly, and typed a single word into an encrypted field. Nightfall. I sent it, then I went to find dinner. The food in the Conclave Station's shared dining area was extraordinary. Dozens of species, dozens of cuisines, and a surprisingly good bowl of something that tasted almost like noodle soup. I sat alone and ate it and watched the stars through the enormous observation window that curved along the far wall. Out there somewhere in the dark, things were already moving. I had not come here to beg for a seat at their table. I had come here because that was what they expected, and giving people what they expect is the oldest and most effective form of misdirection there is. I finished my soup. I thought about my daughter back on Earth, 11 years old, currently in the middle of what she had described in her last message as the worst science project in the history of education. I thought about the leaking roof of my father's house and the way he used to say, when something was broken and stubborn and refusing to cooperate, that you just had to understand the problem before you touched it. I had spent 19 years understanding the problem. The galaxy thought we were weak. The galaxy had been watching the wrong things. Somewhere right now, 47 Vethari warships were moving through a transit corridor they had used 1,000 times before. They had used it because it was fast and safe and completely under their control. They had no idea what was waiting for them in the dark. I ordered a second bowl of soup. I was going to need my strength. Tomorrow, everything would be different. Tonight, all I had to do was wait. I am very good at waiting. We all are. When you spend 10,000 years at the bottom of a food chain, patience stops being a virtue and starts being a survival skill. I looked at the stars and I smiled, just a little, just to myself. Give it time, my father used to say. I gave it 12 more hours. The first alert came through on the Conclave's shared emergency feed at 06:14 station time. I was already awake. I had been awake for 2 hours, sitting in my assigned quarters with a cup of tea, reading a geology report about one of our outer colony moons. The report was not interesting. I was not really reading it. I was listening. When the alert tone sounded, a low, resonant pulse that echoed through the station's walls, I set down my cup, stood up, straightened my jacket, and walked to the observation lounge 2 corridors away. I wanted a screen. I wanted to see the feed directly, not filtered through someone else's summary. The lounge was already half full when I arrived. Delegates from 6 or 7 species stood in loose clusters around the large display wall, their translators murmuring quietly. Nobody was speaking above a whisper. On the screen, the Vethari Fleet Command was broadcasting an emergency signal. The visual showed a standard transit corridor in Sector 7, about 18 light minutes from the Conclave Station. It was a busy lane. Ships moved through it constantly. The Vethari used it routinely for what they called administrative patrols, which was a diplomatic way of saying they liked to remind everyone in that region of space who was in charge. The 47 warships that Counselor Drev had dispatched yesterday had entered that corridor at 23:50 the previous evening. The screen showed the corridor now. It was empty. Not quiet, not reduced, empty. As in no signal, no debris, no distress beacon, no subspace residue, no gravimetric trace. Nothing. The kind of nothing that should be physically impossible for 47 of the most advanced warships in the galaxy to produce simply by being gone. A Vethari communications officer was on screen, speaking rapidly in her own language. The translator caught up with a slight delay. All units confirm last contact at 2351. No response on any frequency. Sensor arrays show no mass presence in the corridor at any point since entry. Repeat, no mass presence. Ships are not showing as destroyed. Ships are not showing as present. Ships are not showing at all. The lounge was very quiet. A delegate from the Murai, one of the same ones who had slid their chairs away from mine yesterday, turned to look at me. I met his eyes calmly. He looked away first. I found a seat near the back of the lounge and sat down. Someone had left a half-finished glass of something pale and fizzy on the table beside me. I moved it aside. I did not want anyone to think I was celebrating. I was not celebrating. I was working. What had happened was this. 31 years ago, Earth launched what was publicly called the Meridian Survey Program. It was the most ambitious deep space mapping project any human institution had ever attempted. Crewed vessels traveling into the outer corridors, charting stellar geography, documenting transit lanes, studying the physics of long-range space travel. That was the public story. It was also true. The ships did do all of that. They had the charts to prove it. What the public story did not include was the secondary payload those ships carried. Small devices, roughly spherical, roughly the size of a basketball, matte black, non-reflective, with no active emissions of any kind. Each one contained a fold space projector no larger than a human fist, a power cell that could run for a century on residual quantum decay, and a receiver tuned to a frequency that existed nowhere in any alien signal catalog because we had invented it ourselves. We had placed 3,000 of those devices across the galaxy's major transit corridors over a period of 3 decades. The Vethari corridor in Sector 7 had 42 of them, placed with careful spacing over 7 years of survey missions. When I sent the word nightfall, a signal had propagated outward from Earth at a speed that had no diplomatic name because no diplomat had ever thought to ask us about our signal infrastructure. By the time the Vethari fleet entered the corridor, all 42 nodes were active, linked, and ready. What Project Shroud did was not violent. That was important to me, and it was important to Earth Command, and it was important for a reason that went beyond ethics, though ethics mattered too. The fold space projectors did not destroy ships. They displaced them. A coordinated activation created a temporary fold envelope across the entire corridor, a bubble of redirected space that shunted anything inside it to a predetermined set of coordinates deep in what we called dark space, a region of empty interstellar void 18 months from the nearest Vethari base at their best travel speed. The ships were there, every one of them, every crew member, alive and well, sitting in a very empty part of space with very full fuel tanks and absolutely no idea where they were. They would find their way home. It would take time. That was the point. On the screen, a second Vethari official had joined the broadcast. This one I recognized, Admiral Corvith, the Hegemony's chief of fleet operations, an angular being with 4 sharp eyes and a reputation for being very difficult to surprise. She was surprised now. I could see it in the tight set of her jaw, the rapid movement of her secondary eyes. "This is not a sensor malfunction," she said to someone off-screen. "A sensor malfunction does not remove 47 ships from physical reality. Something took them. Something we did not detect taking them." That last part, I noted, was said very quietly. I looked around the lounge. The Torvan ambassador was standing very still near the entrance, his enormous eyes fixed on the screen. The Orvai delegate who had whispered an apology to me yesterday was clutching her datapad with both hands. A group of Murai officials were speaking rapidly to each other in their own language, their 4 arms moving in sharp, agitated gestures. Nobody had looked at me again. That was interesting. Usually, in moments of confusion and alarm, beings look for the simplest available explanation and orient toward it. The fact that no one was looking at me suggested they were actively trying not to. They already suspected. They did not want to confirm it yet, because confirmation would require them to rethink everything they believed about the small, quiet human who had sat at the edge of their table yesterday and taken notes. The feed cut briefly and then returned with a new overlay, a real-time scan of the corridor being run by two independent conclave monitoring systems. The results were identical. No ships, no wreckage, no bodies. The corridor was as clean as if the fleet had simply decided to take a different route. I picked up my tea. It was cold. I drank it anyway. An aide from the conclave administrative staff appeared at the door of the lounge and cleared their throat. Emergency session convened in 40 minutes, they announced. All senior delegates are requested to attend. I stood. I smoothed my jacket again. I had worn dark gray today, which I had chosen deliberately. Not the blue of Earth's diplomatic colors, which signaled formality. Not black, which read as aggression in 4 different alien visual cultures. Gray, neutral, unremarkable, the color of something you forget about until you need it. I walked out of the lounge toward the main chamber. As I passed the Torvon ambassador in the corridor, he stopped. I stopped too. He stared at me for a long moment. His black eyes were completely unreadable. "Ambassador Voss," he said, and his voice carried something in it that had not been there yesterday. Not warmth, not exactly respect, something more careful, something that recognized that yesterday's furniture had just stood up. "Ambassador Velk," I replied. He said nothing else. He walked on. I walked on. The emergency chamber was full by the time I arrived. I went to my seat, the same far-edge seat with the same nameplate, and sat down. Around me, the room was louder than I had ever heard it, a wash of different languages all cycling through translators, a noise like several orchestras playing different pieces at the same time. Then Counselor Drev walked in. He was still 3 meters tall. He was still carved from what looked like pale stone, but something had changed in the way he moved. It was not fear exactly, or at least not fear of anything he could name or point to. It was the particular tension of a person who has just learned that a room they thought they owned has a door they did not know about. He sat at the head of the table. He looked at the screen. He looked at his advisors. He looked at the feed. He did not look at me. Not yet. I opened my notepad. I wrote 2 words. 11 seconds. That was how long the fold envelope had been active. From the moment the first node triggered to the moment the last ship registered as displaced. 11 seconds. The most powerful fleet the hegemony had deployed in this sector, gone in 11 seconds, with no warning, no signal, and no explanation that fit inside any existing category of technology they had ever encountered. The session had not officially started. The moderator was still trying to establish order. People were still talking over each other. I looked at the empty Sector 7 corridor on the main screen, and I thought about 47 ships sitting very quietly in a very empty part of the galaxy. Crew members probably looking out of their windows right now, with exactly the same expression that every person in this room was wearing. Confusion, recalibration, the slow, uncomfortable process of realizing that the map you were using was wrong. I thought about my father again, about his hands rough and oil-stained, and the way he would hold a broken engine part up to the light and say, "The thing about a machine is, it always tells you the truth. You just have to learn how to listen." The galaxy had not been listening to us. It was listening now. The moderator finally got the room quiet. Counselor Drev rose to speak. He was controlled. I gave him that. His voice was steady. "This session is called," he said, "to address the unexplained disappearance of Hegemony Fleet Contingent 7. We will hear from Fleet Command, from sensor analysis teams, and from any delegate with relevant information." He paused. The room was completely silent. "If any delegate has relevant information," he said again, and this time there was a very slight shift in his voice, the tiniest additional weight on the word any, "they are invited to speak." He still did not look at me. But I noticed, for the first time, that he knew exactly where I was sitting. I turned a page in my notepad. I wrote "not yet." We were not done. We had barely started. There was so much more I needed to say. And every word of it needed to be said at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right way, for exactly the right reason. I had waited 19 years for this conversation. A few more minutes would not hurt anyone. I let the silence stretch, and in that silence I could feel the room beginning to understand, slowly and with great reluctance, that the person at the edge of the table was not at the edge of anything at all. I let Counselor Drev speak for 22 minutes before I raised my hand. In human diplomatic settings, raising your hand to ask to speak is considered slightly informal, even a little old-fashioned. In this chamber, with its elaborate system of request tokens and procedural protocols, it was practically unheard of. You submitted a digital request. You waited for recognition. You spoke when called upon. I raised my hand. Every eye in the room turned to me. Drev stopped mid-sentence. His 4 eyes moved to my raised hand and stayed there. Around the table, the whisper of translator modules filled the brief silence. The chamber moderator, to their credit, recovered quickly. "The delegate from Earth is recognized." I stood. I did not use the podium. I stayed at my seat because I wanted everyone to look at me sitting exactly where they had put me yesterday, at the far edge of the table, at the seat they had chosen because it was the least important one in the room. "Thank you," I said. I did not rush. Rushing would suggest I was nervous, and I was not nervous. I was the opposite of nervous. I was the kind of calm that only comes when you have been preparing for something for so long that when it finally arrives, it feels less like a crisis and more like a return to something familiar. "I want to tell you something about human beings," I said. "Not the version you have in your records, not the species summary in your threat assessment databases. Something true." I paused and looked around the room, not performing, just looking, making actual contact with the faces turned toward me, the dozens of different kinds of eyes, the variety of expressions ranging from suspicion to reluctant attention. "We evolved on a planet that was trying to remove us from it," I said. "Not metaphorically, literally. Every predator that existed before us was larger, faster, and better equipped. The cold came for us, the heat came for us, disease came for us, starvation came for us. Other species of our own genus came for us, and we survived every single one of those things, not because we were the strongest. We were not because we were the fastest. We were not. We survived because we are the most relentless problem solvers that the process of natural selection has ever accidentally produced." The room was completely still. "We have been in space for 112 years, I continued. In that time, every species in this chamber has looked at our technology and laughed, or looked at our politics and shaken their heads, or looked at our history and decided we were too chaotic, too violent, too contradictory to ever be worth taking seriously. You saw a species that fought amongst itself and called that weakness. What you were actually seeing was a species in training. Every conflict we ever had with each other taught us something. Every failure taught us something. We spent 10,000 years practicing on the hardest possible opponents, which was ourselves, and we never stopped learning from it." I looked at Counselor Drev directly. 40 years ago," I said, "we began placing a network of fold space displacement nodes across every major transit corridor in this galaxy. 3,000 nodes, placed quietly over decades during missions that looked like scientific surveys. Last night, 47 hegemony warships entered one of those corridors. Every node in that corridor activated simultaneously. The ships were displaced to a set of coordinates in uninhabited space. Every crew member is alive. Every ship is intact. They have full fuel reserves. They will find their way home. I gave the room a moment, not for dramatic effect, because some of the translators were running slightly behind, and I wanted to make sure everyone had actually processed what I had said before I continued. Project Shroud, I said, is not a weapon. It cannot destroy a ship. It cannot harm a crew. It is, by design, the most non-violent strategic deterrent that our engineers were capable of building. We built it that way on purpose because we are not interested in removing anyone from existence. We are interested in making a point. The Orvai delegate made a sound I had not heard before. It turned out, I would learn later, to be the Orvai equivalent of an involuntary sharp intake of breath. The point, I said, is this. You called us weak. You called us a pre-threat classification. You drafted terms for oversight of our border territories without asking us, without informing us in advance, and without, at any point, considering the possibility that we might have opinions about it. You did that because you assumed that the gap between your capability and ours was so large that what we thought was irrelevant. I let that sit in the air for a moment. The gap was never where you thought it was, I said. You were measuring the wrong things. It was at that precise moment that the second alert hit the chamber feed. The display wall on the far side of the room activated automatically, overriding whatever it had been showing before. A new feed, live, from the Conclave's own border monitoring system. 14 ships, Drelkai configuration, moving fast toward Earth's nearest colony system. I had been expecting this, not from the Drelkai specifically, but I had known that someone would try. When a show of force disrupts the existing power structure, there is always a faction that reads it as instability and decides to move fast before things settle. The Drelkai Collective was a small but aggressive power that had been quietly encroaching on independent systems for years. They had watched the Vethari fleet disappear and, rather than becoming cautious, had decided it meant the Vethari were weakened and that now was the time to act. They had not stopped to consider what had actually happened to the fleet. The room watched the display. The 14 ships were moving at maximum drive speed directly toward the Aldrin colony, 11,000 human civilians. I picked up my communicator. I sent a 3-digit code. On the display, the 14 ships entered the outer sensor boundary of the transit corridor that connected to the Aldrin system. Then they were gone. No explosion, no debris, no signal. The corridor showed clean in 2 seconds. Not 11 this time, 2. The chamber was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system. I put my communicator back in my pocket. No one on those ships is harmed, I said. They are in the same coordinates as the Vethari fleet. They will have company on the long trip home. I looked around the room one more time. I said that we are not interested in removing anyone from existence, I said. I want to be absolutely clear that this is a choice, not a limitation. We built Shroud to capture and hold, not to destroy. We are capable of building things that destroy. We chose not to because we are trying to tell you something about who we are and what we want. What we want is very simple. We want to be spoken to like we are here, like our presence matters, like our agreement is required before decisions are made about our future. I sat down. The room did not erupt. It did the thing that rooms do when something fundamental has shifted and no one has quite caught up with it yet. It made a low, continuous sound, like a tide going out. Drev was very still. I picked up my pen and wrote in my notepad, in small, neat letters, "They are listening now." My father used to say that the most important part of fixing a broken machine was not the repair itself. It was the moment before. The moment when you put your hand on the casing and felt it and understood what it was trying to tell you. This galaxy had been broken for a long time. The Vethari hegemony had built the Conclave, and they had built it well in many ways, but they had built it for themselves, and everything not built for itself eventually starts to fall apart at the seams. I had not come here to break it further. I had come here to show everyone in this room that the machine could be fixed, if you were willing to listen to what it was actually telling you. The moderator was trying to establish order again. Multiple delegates were submitting speaking requests simultaneously. On the display, the empty corridor where 14 Drelkai ships had been sat quiet and clean. I waited. Outside the observation window behind the main chamber, the stars were exactly where they always were. And somewhere out there, 61 ships full of very confused crews were drifting in the dark, alive and well and completely unable to explain what had happened to them, which was, I thought, probably a useful experience for all of them. I opened a new page in my notepad. The next part of this conversation was going to require very careful words, because I was not just speaking to this room. I was speaking to every species that would read the transcript, every government that would analyze the feed, every military commander who would run the numbers and try to understand what they were actually dealing with. I was about to tell them what we actually wanted. And what we actually wanted was not what any of them expected. That, perhaps, was the most human thing about all of this. The first species to contact me privately was not the Vethari. It was the Torvan. Ambassador Velk sent a text message to my personal terminal 3 hours after the emergency session ended. It was brief. It said, "We would appreciate a quiet conversation if you are willing. No translators. My English is sufficient." I replied, "Dining area, 1 hour." He was already there when I arrived. He had chosen a corner table, which I appreciated. He had ordered nothing, which I also appreciated. It suggested he was not trying to establish comfort or hospitality. He was trying to talk. I sat down. A server brought me tea without being asked, which told me the kitchen staff had been paying attention to my habits. "You surprised us," Velk said. His English was more than sufficient. It was careful and precise in the way that a person speaks a language they have been studying seriously, not casually. "I think that was probably the point," I said. "Yes." He folded 2 of his 4 long fingers together on the table. "I want to ask you something directly, and I would like a direct answer." "I will give you the most direct answer I can," I said. "What do you actually want?" he asked. "Not the diplomatic version, the real version." I looked at him. He was watching me with those enormous black eyes, and there was something in them that I had not seen in any alien face since I had arrived at the station. He was not afraid of the answer. He genuinely wanted to know. "We want to be left alone to grow," I said. "We want our border systems to be recognized as sovereign without conditions. We want a seat at this table that is not at the edge of the table. And we want the conclave to stop being a mechanism that entrenches the power of whoever was already powerful when it was founded." He was quiet for a moment. "That last part," he said, "is going to be extremely difficult." "I know," I said. "I did not say it would be easy. I said it was what we want." He nodded slowly. "The Torvan have wanted the same thing for 60 years, he said. "We have not had the leverage to ask for it." "You do now," I said, "if you want it." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Tell me about Project Shroud, not the technical details. I understand you cannot share those. Tell me its extent." 3,000 nodes, I said. Every major corridor, every primary transit lane, every choke point that ships have to pass through to get anywhere important in this galaxy. He absorbed this. "And the range of the activation signal?" he asked. "From Earth," I said. He went very still. "From Earth," he repeated. "Yes." He uncrossed his fingers. He looked at the table for a moment, then back at me. "You have had this for how long?" "The network became fully operational 9 years ago," I said. "We have been testing individual nodes for 12 years before that." 9 years, he said quietly. "Yes." "And you did not use it?" "No." He leaned back slightly, Why? I picked up my tea. I thought about how to answer that honestly and accurately. Because using it changes things permanently, I said. Once you show what you have, you cannot unshow it. We wanted to be sure that when we showed it for the right reason, at the right moment, in a way that made the right point. And you decided yesterday was that moment. Counselor Drev made it easy, I said. He was very clear about his intentions. He gave us a clean choice. Velk made a sound I could not translate. It might have been something like admiration, or it might have been something like the complicated feeling a person gets when they realize they could have been on the wrong side of something very large. I have to ask, he said, and I ask this with complete transparency, are there other systems, other than Shroud? I looked at him. I thought about what honesty required here, and what wisdom required, and whether those two things were pointing in the same direction. I am not in a position to answer that question, I said. He nodded. He had expected that answer, and I suspected he had asked the question not because he thought I would answer it, but because the act of asking and not receiving an answer was itself informative. We talked for another hour. He told me about the Torvund's history with the Vethari, about the treaty they had signed 40 years ago under what he called coercive conditions, about the resource extraction agreements that had been slowly bleeding their outer colonies. He talked carefully and precisely, and I listened with the same care. By the time we finished, nothing formal had been agreed. No alliance had been declared. No document had been signed. But something had shifted between us, the kind of shift that happens when two people who have both been in difficult situations recognize in each other a common quality. Patience, endurance, the willingness to wait for the right moment. I walked back to the main hall. The second contact was from the Murai, then the Orvai. Then, over the following 6 hours, 12 more species, all smaller powers, all with complicated histories with the hegemony, all suddenly very interested in speaking with the human delegate who had, until approximately 30 hours ago, been the least significant person in the building. I spoke with all of them. I was careful with each conversation. I did not promise things I could not deliver. I did not overstate our capabilities or understate the complexity of what we were proposing. I said to each of them some version of the same thing. We are not here to replace one dominant power with another. We are here because the current structure does not serve anyone except the people who built it. Several of them asked about Shroud. I gave the same answer to all of them. 3,000 nodes, every major corridor activation from Earth. Ships are held not destroyed, all crews alive. The number that none of them could get past was 3,000. It was the number that the room kept returning to, the number that was quietly reorganizing every calculation every military strategist on this station was running in real time. 3,000 nodes meant full coverage. It meant that there was no route a fleet could take to anywhere important in the galaxy that did not pass through a shroud-covered corridor. It meant that any military action against any system anywhere required first dealing with a problem that, as of 24 hours ago, no one had a solution to. It meant the strategic landscape had changed completely, quietly, over 4 decades. While everyone was looking at our primitive ships and our small economy and our internal disagreements, and telling each other we were not worth worrying about. The afternoon session of the conclave was delayed twice before it finally convened at 16:00 station time. Counselor Drev was at the head of the table again. He looked the same physically. He sat the same way. But something in the room's relationship to him had changed, an invisible rebalancing, like furniture rearranging itself when no one was quite looking. He spoke first, which was his prerogative as the hegemony's senior representative. He spoke for 9 minutes about the need for investigation, for understanding, for a measured response. He did not, I noticed, call for retaliation. He did not describe the displacement of his fleet as an attack. He used the phrase unexplained incident 3 times. That told me a great deal. When he finished, I submitted my speaking request through the official system. This time, the moderator recognized me. I stood. "I want to propose something," I said, "and I want to be clear that what I am about to say represents the official position of the Earth Coordination Council, not a personal statement." I looked at Drev. He looked back. It was the first time he had actually met my eyes since the session began. "We are prepared to return every ship," I said. "The Hegemony Fleet contingent, the Drelkai vessels, all of them, navigational assistance included, in exchange for a single commitment from this chamber." I paused. "A new charter," I said. "One that removes the veto power currently held by a single species. One that requires genuine multilateral consent for any decision affecting sovereign territories. One that establishes enforceable protections for border systems regardless of size or military capability." The room was quiet. "We are not asking for control," I said. "We are asking for a structure that does not require any species to choose between submission and confrontation. We are asking for the thing this conclave was supposedly built to provide, which is a place where differences are settled by conversation, not by the size of your fleet." I sat down. Drev looked at me for a very long time. Then something extraordinary happened. The Torvan ambassador, Velk, rose to his feet. He did not request recognition. He simply stood. He said one sentence: "The Torvan stand with the proposal of the Earth delegate." Then he sat down. There were 4 seconds of absolute silence. The Murai senior representative stood. "The Murai Second Council stands with the proposal." Then the Orvai. Then the Halcyon Cooperative. Then species whose names I had only recently learned, rising one after another, not making speeches, not performing for the cameras, just standing, saying their piece, sitting down. 14 species in total. By the time the last one sat down, roughly a third of the chamber was on their feet. Drev had not moved. I looked at him. I kept my face very still and very calm, because this moment required calm, not triumph. "Councillor Drev," I said quietly and only to him across the table, "we are returning your ships regardless of what you decide. I want you to know that. What we did was not a negotiating tactic. It was a demonstration. The ships were always coming back." He stared at me. "What you decide now," I said, "determines what the galaxy looks like for the next century. Not for us, for everyone." He was quiet for a long moment. "You planned this for 40 years, he said. His voice was almost conversational. "We planned it for 40 years, I confirmed. He looked at the 14 standing species. He looked at the screen. He looked at me. "You are a very patient people," he said. "We had good teachers," I said. He said nothing further. The session moderator called a recess for formal deliberation. I walked out into the corridor and stood by the observation window and looked at the stars. I sent a message to Earth. It was a longer message than usual, marked for the full council, not just my direct handler. I told them what had happened. I told them what had been proposed. I told them that 14 species had stood up and that Drev had not said no. Then I added one personal line at the end, not for the council, for the person who would be reading the message later that night when the official briefing was done. "For my daughter. I think it went okay," I wrote. "Tell Dad I used his trick, understanding before touching. It worked." I sent it and looked at the stars and thought about all the ships floating quietly in the dark, waiting to come home. The charter took 11 days to draft. I did not sleep much during those 11 days. Not because I was anxious, but because there was simply too much to do. 11 days of negotiation sessions, bilateral conversations, translation disputes, procedural arguments about what the new framework would look like and who would have what kind of voice in it. And underneath all of that, the slow, patient work of making sure that what emerged was actually useful and not just a rearrangement of the same fundamental problems. I want to be honest about this part. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of process that looks good in a summary or films well for a documentary. It was detailed and exhausting and often frustrating, and there were moments when I was not sure it was going to hold. On the fourth day, the Vethari delegation walked out of the drafting session over a clause about resource agreements in contested systems. They came back 6 hours later. After a conversation I was not present for, but the results of which I could see clearly in the way Drev's advisors sat differently in their chairs when they returned. Later, one of the Torvan aides told me quietly that Velk had made certain information available to certain Vethari officials during that 6-hour gap. Information about the specific terms of the coercive treaty the hegemony had imposed on the Torvan 4 decades earlier, and the resource extraction numbers, which were, apparently, substantially more damaging to Torvan colony systems than even most Vethari officials had realized. It was not a threat, it was a briefing. But sometimes a well-timed briefing changes the room. On the 7th day, the Drelkai representative tried to introduce language that would have created a loophole large enough to maneuver a fleet through. I caught it on the third read of the draft document, at 2 in the morning station time, when I was sitting alone in a conference room with 3 empty cups of tea and a notepad full of cramped handwriting. I flagged it. The language was removed. The Drelkai representative did not speak to me for the rest of the drafting process. On the 9th day, Councillor Drev requested a private meeting. We met in one of the smaller conference rooms near the administrative wing. No aides. No translators, since his English was, I had discovered over the previous days, considerably more functional than he had previously let on. Just the 2 of us and a table and 2 chairs, which I noticed had been arranged as equals, neither chair at the head. He sat down, I sat down. "I have a question," he said. "Ask it." "The Shroud Network," he said. "What happens to it after the charter is signed?" I had been expecting this question for several days. "It stays," I said. He absorbed this permanently. "The nodes are self-sustaining," I said. "Removing them would require locating each one individually, and since they emit no signal in a passive state, that is not a straightforward task." He was quiet. "But," I said, "they can be deactivated, all 3,000 of them, simultaneously from Earth, with a single command. We will include a commitment in the charter that we will not activate Shroud against any signatory nation that is in compliance with the charter's terms." He looked at me carefully. "And if a nation leaves compliance?" "Then we will have a conversation," I said. "Before anything else happens, we will have a conversation." He considered this for a long moment. "You are asking us to trust that you will have that conversation?" "Yes," I said. "Why should we?" I thought about the most honest answer I could give. "Because we had 3,000 nodes and 61 ships in our range, and we did not destroy a single one of them," I said. "We built a system designed specifically not to destroy. We released the crews the moment the charter negotiations began. When we had every strategic advantage, we used it to ask for a conversation, not to demand surrender." He was quiet. "That is what we are," I said. "Not saints, not perfect. We have a long, complicated history and we have done things we are not proud of, but we did not build Shroud to conquer. We built it so that when we finally sat down at this table, the conversation would happen on terms where we were actually heard. That is all we ever wanted, to be heard." Drev looked at me for a very long time. "My species built this conclave 230 years ago," he said finally. "We built it because we had won a series of conflicts that we did not want to fight again. We built it to prevent the kind of large-scale confrontation that had cost us a great deal." "I know," I said. "We built it imperfectly," he said. "We built it for ourselves primarily. I am not certain all of those who built it knew they were doing that, but in retrospect it is clear." "Yes," I said. "This new charter," he said, If it works, it will constrain us significantly. It will constrain everyone significantly, I said, including us. He raised his eyes, including you. We are signing it too, I said, Shroud included. We are binding ourselves to a framework we do not control unilaterally. That is the point. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly, something more complicated. You really are very patient, he said. We had to be, I said. The alternative was confrontation, and we have already had more confrontation in our history than was good for any of us. He nodded slowly. There is one more thing, he said, the question that everyone on my staff is afraid to ask directly. Ask it, I said. He looked at me steadily. Are there other systems beyond Shroud? I had been asked this before. I had given the same answer before. But this time, I thought about what honesty required. About whether the truth in this moment served the outcome we were all working toward, and about the fact that Drev was asking not to be frightened, but to understand the full shape of what he was agreeing to. Yes, I said. He did not react visibly. He had been expecting this answer, I thought, or he had been expecting the confirmation of something he had already suspected. I will not ask what they are, he said. That is probably wise, I said. He stood. I stood. We did not do anything so formal as shake hands, though I was aware that for humans, that gesture carries a great deal of meaning. Instead, we stood for a moment at equal height, or close to it, he being considerably taller, and acknowledged each other with a kind of directness that had been absent from every interaction we had had before this room. I will recommend that the hegemony sign the charter, he said. Thank you, I said. He left. I sat back down. I sat for a while in the empty room and looked at the surface of the table and thought about how strange it was to have spent 19 years working toward a moment that, when it finally arrived, felt almost quiet. The signing ceremony was held on the 11th day. The chamber was full. Every delegation attended. Even the Drelkai, though their representatives sat with the particular stiffness of someone doing something they find extremely uncomfortable. The new charter was 416 pages long. It established a rotating council structure with no single veto power. It created enforceable protections for sovereign territories. It set up an independent monitoring body with representatives from 30 species. It included, in an appendix that had been negotiated very carefully over 2 days, a mutual restraint agreement regarding strategic deterrent systems, with Earth as a signatory alongside 14 others. It was not perfect. No document produced by beings who disagree about fundamental things is ever perfect. But it was honest, and it was specific, and it had teeth, and it had been arrived at through a process that had, however messily and however slowly, involved people being required to listen to each other. When it came time for Earth's signature, I picked up the stylus, which is a very human implement that no other species in the room used. They all had their own equivalent tools, and I signed my name. Ilara Vos, representative of Earth. And then something happened that I had not expected. Ambassador Velk began it. He stood up from his seat and he placed his 4 long hands flat on the table in front of him, which I had learned over 11 days was a Torvan gesture of formal acknowledgement. Not applause, something older and more considered than applause. The Murai followed, then the Orvai, then others, each species doing whatever their version of the gesture was, standing or a particular posture or a sound or a movement. Different forms, same impulse, the room recognizing something that had happened. I stood there at the podium with the stylus in my hand, and I looked at all of them, and I was not certain what to do with my face. I thought about sitting down. I thought about saying something official and measured and appropriate. Instead, I thought about my daughter. She had sent me a message that morning before the ceremony began. She was 12 years old and she had written, with the particular directness of children who have not yet learned that adults sometimes need information delivered more gently, "Mum, are you famous now? My teacher says you are famous. I told her you are just you. Was that right?" I had replied, "That was exactly right." I looked at the room. I put the stylus down. "Thank you," I said, not into a microphone, just into the room. I think most of them heard it. I walked back to my seat, not the edge of the table seat with the forgotten nameplate. My seat had been moved during the drafting process to a central position by mutual agreement because the logistical demands of the negotiation had made it practical, and because no one had objected, and because the nameplate, it turned out, was just a nameplate. I sat down and I looked at the document in front of me and I thought, this is what 40 years looks like. Not the Shroud Network, not the displaced fleets, not any of the dramatic moments that would end up in the summaries and the histories and whatever documentary someone would eventually make about all of this. 416 pages, 11 days, 700 delegates, one table. It looked like work. The ceremony concluded. The delegates began to disperse. There were handshakes and equivalent gestures and conversations beginning, and the whole enormous complicated machinery of diplomacy lurching into a new configuration. Drev passed my seat on his way out. He did not stop, but he paused for the smallest fraction of a moment and he looked at me and he inclined his head just slightly. I inclined mine back. Then he walked on and I sat for a while in the gradually emptying chamber, and I thought about the ships that were, even now, making their way home from the dark space where we had sent them. The crews who had spent 11 days drifting in the quiet and the cold, alive and whole, with a long journey ahead of them and a very strange story to tell when they arrived. They would have had time to think. That had been part of the design, not punishment, not cruelty. Just time and quiet and the particular clarity that comes when you are very far from everything familiar and you have nothing to do but consider where you are and how you got there. I hoped it had been useful. I picked up my notepad. I turned to a fresh page. I thought about what to write, what the right words were for the end of something that had taken most of my adult life to reach. I wrote "done." Then, because that felt insufficient, I wrote "not really." Because it was not really done. The charter was signed, but it would need to be implemented and argued over and interpreted and tested. The conclave would have hard days ahead. Some species would push the limits of the new framework. Some would need to be reminded of what they had agreed to. The monitoring body would need staff and resources and teeth and the political will of multiple species to keep it running. And Earth would have to be part of all of that, not from the edge of the table, from the middle. We had made a promise in those 416 pages about what kind of power we intended to be. That promise was going to require constant, active, imperfect work to keep. I closed the notepad. I called my daughter on the comm. It was early morning in Leeds. She answered on the third ring, still in her pajamas, her hair going in 6 directions, eating toast. "Mum." "Hello, love. Are you done?" "Sort of," I said, "mostly." "Was it good?" I looked around the mostly empty chamber, at the signed charter on the table, at the stars through the observation window, exactly where they always were. "Yes," I said, "I think it was good." "Good." She took a bite of toast. "Can you come home now?" "Soon," I said. "A few more things first." "Okay." She looked at something off camera. "Grandad says hi." "Tell him it worked," I said, understanding before touching. She relayed this, holding the communicator sideways so I could see her walk across the kitchen to where my father was sitting at the table with his own tea. And she said, "Mum says it worked," understanding before touching, and he looked up and he smiled, and he said something back. "He says obviously," my daughter reported. "He says he taught you everything you know." "He did," I said. "Tell him I said so." I ended the call and sat for a moment longer in the empty chamber. Then I stood up, picked up my notepad and my cold tea, and walked out into the corridor. There was a great deal of work still to do. The monitoring body needed establishing. The resource agreement clauses needed follow-up. There were 17 bilateral conversations I had promised to have in the next week, and a full briefing to prepare for the Earth Council, and a report to write that would be, at minimum, 200 pages and would probably make the people who read it very tired. I walked toward the administrative wing. I passed the observation window. I looked out at the stars for one more moment. We had waited, and we had watched, and we had worked in the dark for 4 decades, and we had built something that no one saw coming because no one had been paying attention to us. They had called us weak. They had been measuring the wrong things. What we were, what we had always been, since the first time one of our distant ancestors sat in the mouth of a cave in the dark and thought, instead of running about the problem, was patient, relentless, impossibly difficult to stop, not because we were powerful, but because we did not know how to quit. We had spent 10,000 years learning from failure. We had turned every wound into a lesson, and every loss into data, and every defeat into a reason to try differently next time. And when we finally stepped out into the galaxy, we brought all of that with us. Not the weapons, not the technology, those were just tools. We brought the patience, the endurance, the ancient, stubborn, inconvenient human habit of looking at a broken thing and refusing to walk away from it until it was fixed. The galaxy had not been ready for that. It was going to have to learn to be. I walked on down the corridor, toward the work, toward the long and imperfect future, carrying a notepad and a cold cup of tea. Behind me, through the window, the stars burned quietly in the dark. They had always been there. We were just getting started.